She heard them through the parlor wall. Her mother's voice first, bright and giddy in a way it never was when Clara was in the room. Pemberton said he'd take her. Can you imagine? Someone actually wants her. Then her father, lower, steadier, the voice he used when counting money. The man lives alone up in the mountains. Barely comes to town twice a year. Probably doesn't know what he's getting. A pause, the clink of a crystal glass. By the time he figures it out, it'll be too late. She'll be his problem. And then her younger sister's laugh. Light, careless, the laugh of a girl who had never once been called difficult in her life. I get her bedroom. Clara stood in the hallway with her hand flat against the plaster wall and breathed through her nose until the stinging behind her eyes receded. She was 23 years old. She had been called difficult since she was 9, when she'd told the schoolmaster he'd gotten his arithmetic wrong and then proven it on the chalkboard in front of everyone. Since she was 12, when she'd refused to pretend she found the pastor's son charming. Since she was 17, when she'd walked out of the Hargrove dinner party because Mr. Hargrove spoke to his housemaid in a way that Clara could not sit still and witness. Difficult. As though having eyes and a spine were a defect. She went upstairs and began to pack. She packed practically. 2 wool skirts, 3 shirtwaists, her mother's old riding trousers that no one knew she'd kept, her father's copy of Practical Surveying, which she'd read 4 times and which he'd never once opened, her grandmother's bone-handled knife which she wore at her hip and which made visitors uncomfortable. She packed the way a person packs when they are not planning to return, and she did not cry, and she did not pray, and she did not write a letter to anyone because there was no one she trusted to read it. The morning she left, her father handed her into a hired wagon with the brisk efficiency of a man completing a transaction. Her mother kissed her cheek and said she hoped she would apply herself. Her sister waved from the upstairs window, Clara's window, and Clara looked at her for a long moment and then looked away, up at the mountains, which were blue and enormous and indifferent in the early light. The road up was long. The driver, a weathered man named Ott, who smelled of tobacco and old leather, said nothing for 2 hours and then said, "Pemberton's place is something, if you like quiet." Clara asked what Pemberton was like. Ott thought about it for a while. "Fair," he said finally. "I've seen a lot of men up in these mountains. He's fair." He didn't say anything else about it, and Clara didn't push him, and the wagon climbed, and the trees thickened, and the air turned cool and smelled of pine and something darker underneath, something like iron and rain. She expected a rough thing. A crude house, a crude man, the bare minimum of civilization hung up like a single curtain over a broken window. She had braced herself for it the whole journey, had made herself catalogs of worst cases the way she always did. If it is bad, I will endure it. And then I will find a way out. And I always find a way out. So that when the wagon crested the last rise and she saw the ranch, it took her a moment to understand what she was looking at. It was not crude. The main house was hewn timber and riverstone, low and long with a deep porch, and it sat in a high meadow that looked out over 3 ranges of mountains, in a view that made her chest compress strangely, like something large was trying to open inside it. The fences were mended. The barn was sound. There were 2 dogs sleeping in the afternoon sun, and a kitchen garden so orderly it looked almost deliberate, and there was a man standing at the fence near the paddock who turned when the wagon came up the track, and that was Eli Pemberton. She didn't know what she'd expected. Someone older, someone harder looking. He was perhaps 30, lean and dark-haired, with the kind of stillness about him that comes either from great peace or great wariness, and she couldn't tell yet which. He walked to the wagon. He looked at her, not the way men usually looked at her, assessing and already deciding, but more carefully than that, more quietly. And then he said, "Miss Aldridge, I'm glad you arrived safely." He helped her down from the wagon, which he did efficiently and without theater, and he paid Ott, and he said, "I'll show you the house." She waited for what came after the house. The conditions, the expectations, the rules laid out with the calm authority of someone who had already decided everything. She had grown up in a house full of such pronouncements, and she had learned to track them like weather, to see them coming. He showed her the kitchen, the parlor, the 2 bedrooms. He showed her the well and the outhouse and the smokehouse. He showed her where the dogs slept and what they were called, Scout and Marble, and he showed her the barn. And then he stopped in the middle of the barn with the late light coming through the gaps in the boards, and he looked at the floor for a moment, and he said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "Your family asked me to pay them a bride price," he said. "I didn't." She felt something shift in her chest. "Then what?" "I don't buy people," he said simply. the way he might state that he didn't brand his horses or cheat his hands. What I offered was this: stay 1 month. Work the ranch, learn it, see if it suits you. If after a month you want to leave, I'll give you a horse and enough money to go wherever you choose. No one will come after you. He looked up at her then. And if you stay, it'll be because you decided to, not because your family sold you and not because I paid for you. Clara stood in the amber light of the barn and looked at this man she didn't know, and she felt the careful scaffolding she'd built in her chest, all that bracing, all those worst cases, begin to creak under a weight she hadn't anticipated. Not fear. Something stranger and more difficult than fear. Why, she said, because she was always asking why when other people accepted what was in front of them. He seemed to expect the question. He was quiet for a moment, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which was unusual, because silences around Clara were usually the kind that meant she had said something wrong again. Then he said, 3 years ago I was in Cartwright. There was a situation outside the mercantile. Old Hector Vane, who worked the loading dock, had broken a crate, and the merchant Dunsmore was threatening to have him arrested for the cost of it. Hector was maybe 65 years old, couldn't afford what Dunsmore wanted. There were a dozen people standing around watching. He paused. A young woman pushed through the crowd and told Dunsmore she'd seen Cartwright's ordinance posted in the courthouse window, the one that required merchants to post bond for contracted workers before levying damages. She said if he wanted to proceed, he could prove he'd posted bond, or he could let Hector go. She had a voice like she'd been practicing being sure her whole life. He looked at her steadily. Dunsmore let him go. Clara remembered it. The heat of that afternoon. The dry smell of the street dust. Old Hector Vane's hands shaking. She hadn't thought about it since. That was you, he said. That was nothing, she said. Anyone could have done it. No one did. She had no answer for that. I'm not telling you this to impress you or to make you feel obligated, he said. I'm telling you because I want you to understand I know what you are. Your family called you difficult. I watched you spend 20 minutes in the sun reading courthouse postings on the chance that someone might need them someday. He turned back toward the barn door. The month starts tomorrow. The cook stove burns a little hot on the left side. She was given her own room, and she lay in it that first night listening to the dark, which had a different quality here than it did in her family's house. There, the dark was thin and full of the sounds of people trying to get comfortable. Here the dark was enormous and complete, and the stars were so dense through the window that they looked almost liquid, and the silence was the silence of something that had always been there. Patient and enormous and old. She lay in it and thought about a man she didn't know standing outside a courthouse for 20 minutes reading ordinances in the summer heat, just in case. She started in the kitchen because that was what made sense, and because the cook stove's left side burn problem interested her. She solved it in 4 days with a damper adjustment that she was unreasonably pleased about. She cooked plainly and well, and Pemberton ate without comment, but cleaned his plate completely, every time, which she decided counted. Then she moved to the kitchen garden, because it was almost autumn and there was work to be done before the cold came, and she was precise and hard-working, and did not require instruction, and she noticed that this seemed to surprise the 2 ranch hands, brothers named Dougie and Cal, who worked the lower pastures and occasionally stopped to stare at her in a way that suggested they'd heard things about what the new woman at Pemberton's place would be like. She did not attempt to charm them. She was not and had never been a charming person. But when Cal's roan mare got a stone bruise and he couldn't figure the angle of the hoof to draw it, she came over without being asked and showed him, because she'd read about it and the mare was in obvious pain, and that was the kind of thing that simply needed doing. After that, Cal tipped his hat to her. It was a small thing. It sat in her chest like a coal. The days fell into shape. She learned the ranch the way she learned everything, systematically, without sentimentality, filing observations the way other people filed letters. She learned that the north fence needed replacement in 2 sections. She learned that the root cellar had a water problem in the southwest corner. She learned that Pemberton rose before dawn every morning and walked the perimeter of the upper pasture alone, which she knew because she also rose before dawn, and saw him returning when she came out to start the fire, and he would nod at her as he passed, and she would nod back, and this exchange she came to understand was its own form of conversation. He never told her what to do. He did not direct her or instruct her or suggest that certain tasks were not suitable for her consideration. When she proposed fixing the root cellar's drainage problem, he said how, and listened to her explanation, and then said there's a box of iron spikes in the second shelf of the barn, and that was that. When she reconfigured the kitchen garden layout so the winter squash had proper airflow, he walked through it one afternoon and stood looking at it for a moment and then said, "That's better than what I had," with the simple honesty of a man who did not feel diminished by being wrong. She was trying to decide what to do with that. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks into her month, when she understood something had changed. She was on the porch in the late afternoon patching a section of feed sacking that had torn, and he came and sat in the other chair. They had reached the stage of being on the porch together without it requiring explanation, and he had his knife out, working at a piece of tack. They sat in the long, golden silence with the mountains going purple in the distance and the dogs arranged at their feet, and Clara thought, with the sudden clarity of someone reaching the bottom of a long calculation, "I am not miserable." It was so startling that she looked up sharply. He was looking at the mountains. The line of his profile was clean and serious. He had a way of existing in space that took up exactly the room he needed and no more, which was unusual in her experience of men. Most men she knew filled every room they stood in with opinions or expectations, or the simple implied weight of their wanting. Pemberton seemed to have made a decision, long ago, to only say what needed saying and let the rest take care of itself. She thought about 3 years of a man reading courthouse postings on a summer afternoon. She thought about, "I don't buy people." She thought, "What is this?" Her father arrived on a Friday. She saw the dust of the wagon from the upper fence line where she'd been working, and she knew before she could see who it was, because she had always been able to feel her father's approach the way some people felt weather. She came down from the fence and she was standing in the yard when he rode up, and the familiarity of his face, the particular set of his mouth when he wanted something, did something cold and bracing to her, like water from a mountain stream. He did not greet her. He said, "Pemberton hasn't paid." "No," she said. "We had an arrangement." "You had an expectation," she said. "He's not paying. I believe he told you this." Her father's face went through several things quickly. "Clara, you don't understand. You told Mother it would be his problem once he figured out what he was getting," she said. "I heard you through the parlor wall." She watched his face. "I want you to understand that I know exactly what brought me here. I want you to understand that it doesn't matter." Pemberton had come out onto the porch. He stood with his arms at his sides, not intervening, watching. Her father turned to him. "The girl is owed to me." There was an understanding. "There was no contract," Clara said before Pemberton could answer. "There was no agreement signed. You cannot enforce an expectation." She had thought about this for 3 weeks, quietly, in the back of her mind, the way she always kept things that needed thinking. "If you try, I will go to the magistrate in Garin County, and I will explain that you attempted to extract payment for a woman without her knowledge or consent, which is not a thing the county looks on favorably, as I believe you know." She met his eyes. "Go home, father." He went, not without ugliness. There were things said, low and bitter, the kind of things parents say to daughters who will not be managed. But he went, and she stood in the yard and watched the dust of his wagon until it disappeared below the tree line. And then she stood there a little longer, until the cold feeling in her chest dissolved. Pemberton came to stand beside her. He said nothing. After a moment she said, "I'm sorry you had to hear that," and he said, "You don't need to apologize for him." And she said, "I know. I'm apologizing for myself. I should have handled it before he came up here." "You handled it fine," he said. "I was angry." "You were right," he said. "Those aren't the same thing, but they weren't contradictory either in this case." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the tree line where her father's wagon had gone, and his expression was careful and steady, and she thought, not for the first time but more certainly than before, that this was a man who had thought very seriously about what it meant to be fair and had then simply tried to do it, every day, without announcements. Her month was almost up. 3 days before it ended, 2 men came up the mountain with a warrant. She was in the barn when she heard the horses, and by the time she came out, they had Pemberton in irons, county men officially, with a paper from the magistrate in Garin claiming debt fraud. Debt fraud. She watched Pemberton look at the paper and then look at her, and his face was the face of a man who had expected something like this might happen and had decided not to trouble her with the possibility, and she felt something in her chest go absolutely still and absolutely certain. "Ride down to Garin," he said when they put him on his horse. "Don't." She was already untying her horse. She rode down the mountain faster than she had ever ridden anything, with the wind burning her face and her grandmother's knife at her hip and the precise contents of the Garin County debt ordinance arranged in her mind, because she had read it, because she read everything, Because she had spent 23 years reading things on the off chance that knowledge would become necessary, and it had always, always become necessary. She arrived in Garin 2 hours before they did, on account of knowing a lower track that Ott had mentioned, and she went directly to the telegraph office and sent 3 wires, and then she went to the magistrate's office and she sat down across from a man named Cobb, who had the careful eyes of someone used to getting what he wanted through paperwork. She put her father's name on the table between them like a card. She explained the timeline. She explained that a fraudulent warrant required a complaint, and that the complaint had been filed by a man who had no legal standing to claim anything from Eli Pemberton, because no debt existed, because no contract had been signed, because she had been present for every conversation, and she was prepared to testify to every word. She said this calmly, without heat, in the voice she had been practicing her whole life, the voice that knew things and was not interested in being disbelieved. Cobb looked at her for a long time. "Your father carries some weight in this county," he said. "I know," she said, "but I've sent word to the circuit judge and the Harfield Gazette. I expect the judge will be here by Thursday. The Gazette will run whatever I tell them sooner than that." She folded her hands on his desk. "Mr. Cobb, I don't believe you signed that warrant because you wanted trouble. I believe someone asked you to, and you thought the trouble would land somewhere else. I'm here to explain that it won't." Pemberton was released before sundown. He came out of the county office into the long evening light, and she was leaning against the fence post across the street, still in her riding clothes, with Scout and Marble's absence suddenly very apparent because she had left too fast to think about them, and she made a note to herself that she found she missed the dogs, which was information. He crossed the street and stood in front of her and looked at her for a moment in that careful, quiet way he had. "You rode down alone," he said. "Yes. How did you know about the circuit judge?" "I didn't," she said. "I know how county magistrates think." He looked at her for another long moment. The light was going gold and everything was very still. "Your month is up in 3 days," he said. "I know. The offer stands." She looked at the mountains above the town, the long blue shapes of them in the evening, and she thought about the dark quality of the silence up there, and the view from the high meadow, and the dogs in the sun, and a man who read courthouse postings and did not buy people and said you were right without it costing him anything because it had never occurred to him that it should. "I don't want a horse," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." They were married in Garin 6 weeks later, in the courthouse, with Ott as witness and Dougie and Cal cleaning up reasonably well in the second row. Her father did not come. Her sister sent a letter that Clara read once and set aside without answering. The magistrate Cobb, surprisingly, shook her hand afterward and said she'd have made a good attorney, which she filed away as the second most interesting thing anyone had said to her all year. Pemberton. Eli, she was learning to say, though the name still felt new in her mouth, like a word in a language she was just beginning, said very little, which was consistent with his general practice, but he said it with a quality of attention that she was coming to understand was its own form of eloquence. He was attentive the way mountains were attentive, vast, steady, not indifferent to what passed in front of them, but not performing concern either. Just present with a completeness she had spent her whole life not knowing she was looking for. On the ride back up the mountain, they stopped at the high point of the track where the view opened, and you could see 3 ranges going blue into the distance, and they sat on their horses in the last of the afternoon and looked at it without saying anything. And it occurred to Clara, with the particular quality of recognition that comes when something true finally names itself, that she was not performing. She was not being careful. She was not filing away observations about how this might go wrong. She was simply there, on a mountain, next to a man who had waited 3 years for her to be someone he'd seen for 20 minutes on a hot afternoon in Cartwright, and she found, when she looked at it squarely, that this was the least frightening thing that had ever happened to her. "The south fence will need the new posts before November," she said. "I know," he said. "I can do the east section if you take the corner." "All right." The mountains went darker blue. The air smelled of pine and the coming cold. Scout, who had apparently followed them halfway down the mountain that morning out of pure stubbornness, came bounding up through the trees and collapsed at their horses' feet, panting with enormous satisfaction. And Eli made a sound that Clara had not heard from him before, low and warm, almost a laugh. And she thought, there it is. The thing underneath the stillness. The thing that had been waiting, like the ranch and the silence and the view, for someone to come up the mountain and stay. She was not difficult. She had never been difficult. She had been, from the beginning, exactly what this high country needed, someone who read courthouse postings and fixed dampers and told the truth without apology and did not flinch from the cold quality of things that needed doing. Someone who knew that fair was not a small word. The town talked. Of course it talked. They talked about the Aldridge girl who'd gone up the mountain to the recluse, and then talked some more about her riding down alone and facing down the magistrate, and then talked differently about her after that, in the tone people use when they are revising their understanding of something. In Cartwright, old Hector Vane heard the story from someone who'd heard it from someone, and he sat on his porch in the long autumn afternoon and nodded slowly, the way a man nods when the world makes a kind of sense he thought it had stopped making. On the mountain, Clara put up the winter stores and worked the fence line and argued cheerfully with Dougie about the best way to treat a post hole in rocky soil, and in the evenings she sat on the porch while the dark came down enormous and full of stars, and she was not waiting for anything, which was new, and she was not bracing for anything, which was newer still, and next to her the man she had chosen, who had, long before she knew it, chosen her, was simply present, in the way of mountains, in the way of things that have decided to stay. She had spent 23 years being someone's problem. She had finally become at last her own answer.